and I post pictures of my dogs, which get a lot more likes than I do when I post pictures of myself. And my mother is always fascinated when she comes with me here in the States and we go to a dog park. And she always says, I just don't get it. It's just a dog. Get over it. And I always have to explain to her, well, it's a little bit more than just a dog. And as I work internationally, I've seen this in the Philippines when I've brought my American colleagues who have not been outside of our country before. And they say, how can the Filipinos treat their dogs this way? And I said, well, there are a lot of very different ways of looking at how we interact with animals. And I remember just a couple of years ago, we welcomed a Japanese exchange student into our home. And this whole notion of taking dogs out for a walk and taking them to a dog park next to 7-Eleven, he thought this was the most fascinating thing. He had never, well, 7-Eleven because you could get Kit Kats, and this resonated with him on some level. But the idea that you could take dogs to a dog park was something that he just couldn't get his head around. And he subsequently sent me a message saying, you know, I'm trying to send you some dog food through the mail, but they won't let me get it through. So animals really connect us. And I think when we think about today's event, which is part of a series that we do called Managing Our Planet, which is we do together with George Mason University and our Brazil Institute, that's looking at really key critical issues for us as we connect to the planet and our well-being. This sense of measuring what matters in terms of systems change and happiness and what it means for true well-being of us as individuals, but also for animals as they are part of our lives is a very important dimension of the dialogue for those of us who work on international development are not always quick to understand, appreciate, plan for, and think about why this is an important approach to holistic development. So I'm pleased that we have an opportunity to have this conversation here today. I hope that you've gotten a copy of the report Measuring What Matters, True Wellbeing for Animals and People, because you're going to hear more about it today. And we're going to kick off our discussion with a presentation from Beth Allgood. And I love your last name. It's just Allgood. And you have copies of everyone's bios. But Beth is the U.S. Country Director for the International Fund for Animal Welfare, and she directs the strategic development and implementation of their U.S. projects, campaigns, and political advocacy, with a special focus on the U.S. role in ivory trade, wildlife security issues, and U.S. marine protection. And she's particularly pleased and proud of having created and led their innovative work to look beyond GDP for alternatives that better promote happiness and well-being for people, animals, and the planet. So Beth, welcome. I hand it over to you, and we'd love to hear about the report and about your work.
Great, thank you so much. And thank you all very much for coming. It's really a pleasure to be here and to talk about the report, which I am very proud of, and mostly to turn it over to the people to talk about the case studies, because that's really the exciting part, is to see how it plays out on the ground. But first, I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of why we came up with the report, how the systems change piece might play into it, because that's really my passion. So you're going to get to share it for just a little bit. So before I get started, I just want to ask you to close your eyes for just a minute, indulge me please, and think about a time when an animal made you happy. I see smiles, so I think you've thought of something, so you can open your eyes. And maybe you thought about a time with your cat or your dog. A lot of people probably thought of that. Maybe you thought about a time seeing wildlife in the wild, or hearing a bird sing in a tree outside your house, or maybe when you were hiking or something like that. Now, want to ask you how you think our current economic system supports that happy experience. Right. It really doesn't, depending on what you thought of. It probably doesn't. Because GDP, our current economic system, values short-term economic productivity, usually measured in 3-month intervals, quarterly, over pretty much anything else, right? So it would value your time at work over time at home with your animals. It would value a shopping mall instead of that wild land. And it would value cutting that tree down and selling it at Home Depot instead of a place for a bird to sing, right? So, in fact, Robert F. Kennedy said in 1968, in a beautiful speech that you can find on YouTube if you're interested in the whole thing, that a country's gross domestic product measures everything except that which makes life worthwhile. And Simon Kuznets, who was the economist who created GDP after the Great Depression, which he did to sort of measure whether our companies, our industry was up and running again. That's why he created it. It's a great measure for that. That's what it's for. And he presented it to Congress, and when he did, he said, "The measure of a nation can scarcely be inferred from a measurement of national income as defined by the GDP. It's not a bad measure. It was never meant to be a measure of well-being." That's the point. This is the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. You may recall that Hurricane Katrina was devastating. It was devastating for the environment. It was devastating for people. This was IFAW responding to rescue animals after this disaster. And so it was pretty bad for animals too. There was not a lot of planning before Katrina for what would happen to people's animals. That's changed since. We've learned some lessons. It was great for GDP. Just an example, again, of how when we make the assumption, when we hear on the radio that GDP is up, that we're all doing great, we're assuming something that isn't true, right? And these are some examples. Katrina, crime is another example. Crime, great for GDP, pretty much bad for everything else. Elephants. As you all know, I'm sure, we're losing elephants. Depending on the statistics, right now we're thinking it's about 1 every 30 minutes due to poaching. More elephants are dying every year than are being born, certainly unsustainable. This crisis has some impact on GDP, right? GDP goes up with ecotourism, no question, but most of the value of elephants lies well beyond something that can be measured by GDP. They contribute to the ecosystem. They disperse seeds, they dig water holes, they have a lot of ecosystem values, ecosystem service values. They have other values. They have spiritual values, they have cultural values. If there were no, those are to people, those are values that elephants give to people. They have intrinsic value. If there were no people, elephants would still have value, right? They would have intrinsic value. And if we lost elephants, we would certainly lose a lot more than money could measure, right? And I believe that our system has contributed to ivory poaching in one specific way, in that ivory has value in a way that elephant lives don't. The same can be true of basically any animal product, right, that we trade in. The pieces of the animal have values that the lives of the animal don't, to people, and that's what we're talking about. Rhino horn, tiger pelt, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the bad news. I'm going to get to the better news. You may know that in Bhutan, they have another system. They have gross national happiness. It has 9 domains. Here they are on the screen. And I've been working in Washington for over 20 years, trying to save wildlife, habitat, improve animal welfare, and sometimes it works. You get a policy to stop ivory trade, for example, illegal ivory trade. you get a protected area saved. But with pressure like our current system exerts, there's always another development project in a to put pressure on a protected area. There's always another animal product to take its place. And as long as we value short-term productivity over everything else, you'll have this problem. So when I heard about gross national happiness, it was like a bolt of lightning. I thought, hey, there's another way. That's amazing. And in fact, there are lots of other ways. There's the Genuine Progress in Maryland, Genuine Progress Index in Maryland and Vermont. There's a whole suite of them all over the world. And once you hear about it, it's just incredible. So that's where this report was born. The first half looks at measures, different measures that go beyond GDP. The second half takes the gross national happiness domains and looks at how animals contribute to human well-being in each of the 9 domains. And that's really what we're here to talk about, but I couldn't not talk about the fact that there are other ways, because I just think that's so exciting. So we have the reports, and I hope you'll take one. We look at peer-reviewed research in each of the domains about how animals contribute to well-being. So it's not my opinion of, yes, they make you happy, sure, but they make you happy in these specific ways according to researched reports about it. And then we have case studies to show that. So basically, the main question I get is, why did we do it? We did it because the extinction crisis adds urgency to change the system now. We can't wait. We have to talk about broader measures now before we lose these animals that are so important. And we can bring animal welfare and conservation into this new system in a really meaningful way. And also, we need to plan for animals in these people-centric policies. And we can do that by showing that animals contribute to human well-being. So our current system doesn't value animals, people, or the planet over economic growth yet. And we should absolutely promote growth. I'm not anti-growth, but we should grow what matters, not just what we've been measuring for the past, 60, 70 years, right? So we're super excited to show you how that works on the ground with these case studies. And I will turn that over.
Thank you very much, Beth. So you ended in a photo with kids in an animal costume, being very happy. So I think some really important framing for us, recognizing that GDP is not a measure of well-being. I think a very compelling statement. What happens when you lose more than money can measure? What happens when you lose more than money can measure? Very interesting. And this sense that we value pieces of the animal more than the whole animal, what that means for us, and that there is actually research demonstrating the different ways that animals contribute to our well-being and happiness. So we're going to hear from our colleagues who are going to talk about a number of case studies that will demonstrate this for us. Sean Sweeney is at the Jane Goodall Institute as the Senior Director of Community Engagement. And I love that his bio says that he's fervently passionate. He's fervently passionate about the intersection of wildlife conservation, human development, and humane education. And I know that when we've had Jane Goodall here, she always talks about growing up and Tarzan and that other Jane. So we're delighted to have you here, Sean, and I hand it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much. Really glad to join everyone here, and I'm glad that you've already invoked Jane. I like doing that too, because we are very fortunate to have many little pieces of wisdom. And in the context of this conversation, one of the things that really attracted me in wanting to work with Beth on this is something that Dr. Goodall talks about quite often, and this idea that we often operate on this idea that we can have infinite economic growth. At least that's how it feels, even if that's not literally what's happening. It feels that way on a planet that has finite natural resources. And we're going to get to a point where we can't grow anymore using the models that we're using. We're going to run out of stuff to use to grow. So we have to start thinking about other ways. And another wonderful thing that Dr. Goodall is great at helping us do is continue to remain hopeful about how we can proceed. And Jane is always talking about how important it is for us to continue coming together like this and innovating new ways of thinking about how we approach the world. And I'm really glad to have an opportunity to share a little bit about the work that she inspired and that continues to go on in Africa in our work to protect chimpanzees. So at the Jane Goodall Institute, we work on protecting chimpanzees, as I mentioned, and a function of that is protecting their habitat. Chimps are threatened mainly because of loss of habitat that's driven by many different factors. Jane herself is known for her research on chimpanzees in Gombe National Park, but that work has grown now into a worldwide effort to not only protect chimpanzees, but many other species as well. Our focus today is on that work in Africa and on chimps. What really inspired Jane to begin doing conservation work, even in the 70s when our organization was founded, was a discovery she made when she was flying over the national park where she did her research, that all the way up to the boundary of the national park, the forest had been completely destroyed. So the chimpanzees living in there were basically living in a forest island. There was no way that they could get out of the park and be able to mix with other populations of chimpanzees. The next discovery that Jane made was that the people that were causing that deforestation were living in incredible poverty. And Jane knew that there was no way that we could work to protect and save chimpanzees unless we were working to help meet the basic needs of those communities that were living near chimpanzee habitat. So, and those basic needs are ones that certainly we can't measure with GDP necessarily and other forms of measures, but measures like we're talking about in the report are ones that can measure those basic needs and at the same time hopefully help us protect chimps. So as I mentioned, our work is focused on helping communities become our partners in conservation by helping meet those basic needs. And that work is set up in a way where we actually work with the communities by listening to the needs that they have, what needs aren't being met, and develop programs that help meet those needs. And they fall into 9 different programs. I won't go through all of them. Much of our work, it was founded in Jane's science, so we like to apply science in the conservation that we're doing. We like to work with communities, and this is the emphasis of our success story today, on helping communities plan how their land is being used, and both for their own needs, but also for the chimps. Doing direct work to protect great apes, advancing sustainable livelihoods through things like microcredit and sustainable agriculture projects like coffee. Big emphasis on gender and the intersection of gender, health, and conservation, with a big emphasis on empowering women and ensuring that young girls can stay in school. Doing general public awareness campaigns. Many people are unaware of the impact that they're having on their own community, and just generally raising awareness about those issues are very important. And then supporting policies that, advance our work, and as we mentioned before, our work with young people and helping them become the stewards of the environment that they're living in. And all of these programs come together in working with communities to support all these different domains across in this case, the gross national happiness. Certainly working on the environment and what that does to contribute to people's relative happiness, increasing people's living standards through better livelihoods, as I mentioned, working on health programs that meet, many places where we work. Health issues are prevalent, especially for women. Access to health care, access to medicine, those sorts of things are important. And what I'll emphasize today is good governance. So helping communities manage their land in a way that puts them in control of how they're using their land. And from our perspective, also using the land in a way that will help chimpanzees. So those are the ones I highlight, but we could certainly, if we had more time, talk about how we're aligning ourselves with all of those different indicators. So as I mentioned, getting into our success story a little bit, what we're really trying to do is help communities meet their needs while we're also helping meet the needs of wildlife. And in the case study that we have in the book, we highlight work that we do in Western Tanzania around Gombe National Park, where with the 52 villages that we're working with around the park, we help them do land use planning. This is a practice where planning how to use your land may not sound that complicated, but it can be pretty technical, especially in a really mountainous, hilly environment like Western Tanzania. And as a matter of Tanzanian law, it's actually required that people do land use planning. But because it's so technical, it can be pretty challenging for communities to follow through on that. What the Jane Goodall Institute does is we come in and work with these communities that we've been implementing these programs with already to plan how their land is going to be used. And in part, that land is including an area that, I don't know if this pointer will work, but the light green area is land that the communities have set aside as private forest reserves. And that land is land that we've stitched together in doing all this planning that stretches all the way from the dark green area up to the border with Burundi, where it's met with more forest and more chimpanzees. So that protected forest is an area that the chimpanzees in Gombe can use to go up to meet up with other chimpanzees. And the communities actually derive benefits from having the forest there. People can forest for mushrooms in the forests, forage for mushrooms in the forest. They can do beekeeping and that sort of thing there. So there's a lot of benefits that they have to having the forest there. And they also have all of their other land planned out for how they're gonna use it. And they know what their land is being used for. And they also know that the forest is being protected. So just to give you an example of whether or not this works, this is a satellite image of one village in this area that we're working in called Kigali. This image is from 2005, and while it looks green, there is quite a lot of bareness in there. So if we move forward about 10 years to 2014, you can see there's a lot more green. So this is certainly not something that we're seeing consistently quite yet, but there's great hope that this model works really well, that it's working with communities on all these different ways, trying to understand their needs, meet those needs, and improve their lives, all motivated by trying to help protect chimps, produces really great results for the chimps. This is just another zoomed in version of that same area, so you can see some of the detail there. And we can even look at other models, so you can kind of see that in the satellite images, there's good indication that the forest has regrown, but we can even look at other more detailed models that prove that the forest has come back. So again, side by side here, you have 2005 and 2014 here. So you can see very much that the forest has come back. And the last thing I'll leave us with on this case study is closing a feedback loop that we've needed to do for a long time with communities. A lot of times we'll see where this kind of conservation planning will happen with communities, and the NGO will come and do the planning and do all the work with them, and then the communities will never really hear about it again, except being told what to do and where to do it. A lot of this work for us involves doing monitoring with communities where they tell us how things are going. And that data at one point was just going up into the cloud, and they wouldn't have access to it at all. What we've done is, working with the communities, created what we call the Western Tanzania Forest Dashboard. And this dashboard takes that data that they've collected in monitoring their forests and puts it back in their hands. So as they're doing their conservation planning and they're owning this work that they're doing, they actually have the data in their hands to help reinforce their governance of how they're using their land. So, and ultimately closing that feedback loop, trying to work with them to meet all of these needs, is leading to helping improve the habitat that we know we need for the chimps. And we know even in Gombe that in the last couple of years, we've had a couple of new female chimps that have come into the park that are genetically unrelated to the other chimps in the park. So we know that's an indicator that we're moving things along in the right direction, hopefully. So that's where I'll leave it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sean. I think some keywords for us, chimps, habitat, basic needs, communities, partnership, science, governance, relative happiness. So thank you. Really critical. I think one of the programs that I saw that you had up there was your Roots and Shoots program, which many of us who are familiar with the program know that it really works at engaging young people and thinking about what this means for mentoring. We know that Jane Goodall is very much committed to mentoring. And as we think of our next speaker, Kate Natras Atema, I was pleased to see that Kate specifically talks about how much she values mentoring. Kate is the director of the Global Companion Animal Program at IFAW, and that involves working on community-based dog and cat welfare projects and campaigns in 13 countries on 6 continents. And as I looked at Kate's background, I was quite intrigued to see that she has a master's degree in animals and public policy, which is great. That sounds wonderful, from Tufts. So Kate, welcome. We're delighted to have you here with us, and we're looking forward to learning more about wild and stray dogs in Bosnia.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here as well, and I will hope to hit on many of those keywords. Somebody keep track. So I wanted to talk about how dogs impact the happiness and well-being of communities. So we need to transport ourselves for just a moment. You may have traveled to a place where dogs aren't kept the way they are here in Washington. So here we see dogs walking on leashes, dog parks. They probably go home and eat nutritious food maybe twice a day and sleep on an orthopedic bed. So we're thinking about dogs in a very different context. You may have traveled to the Caribbean or Mexico or parts of Africa or Asia where you see dogs being kept on the streets. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they're unowned dogs. In many cases, those dogs may have been allowed to roam freely by their owners. Some of them may have gotten lost and not gone home. Some of them may have been born on the street. And usually there's a mix of those happening. But if you can imagine living in one of those communities, whether or not we like dogs or whether or not we care about how they're doing out there, that can be a real problem for us. Even I, who really love dogs, have found myself in situations in Bosnia where I've felt the need to cross the street away from dogs that were threatening. I had a colleague whose running tights got a hole in them because dogs ran after her. And she was there to protect them. I was like, how did they not know that? But this can be a real issue for people in their daily lives. They have roaming dogs outside their homes. They have roaming dogs preventing them from going to market areas in their communities. They may usually have dogs congregating around the schools. Dogs know what time school starts and what time it ends. Children are very good for food as a food source. So you have parents very concerned about their children walking alone and unaccompanied to school. So whether or not we like dogs, we do find that they pose challenges to communities around the world. On the other hand, I've also never experienced a single community where there aren't people who care deeply about the dogs on the streets. And I think this is an important point to remember, because while that's a really beautiful thing, it can create conflict in communities that I'm going to talk a lot more about. But the point is that people care about dogs no matter what context they live in. If you live in a rubbish dump somewhere, you may keep dogs and spend your time trying to forage for yourself as well as your dogs. In other contexts, you have dogs that keep you company. You enjoy watching your dogs breed because children really love playing with the puppies. So people have dogs for different reasons, and they will protect them or would like to protect them better in most cases. When we began working with the United Nations Development Program in Bosnia, they had set up community security forums. So this is post-war Bosnia, and they wanted to make communities more secure. They'd set up security forums, and those forums came back, and they anticipated getting requests to help with things like reducing juvenile violence, reducing petty theft, reducing small arms in the community. And a number of these communities came back and said that roaming dogs were one of their #1 security concerns. Now, the UNDP really didn't know what to do with this information. So they approached IFAW, and we worked together on developing a program that would not only be sustainable and promote animal welfare, but also promote community well-being. And so we did some research to think about how we could better understand not just the problems with the dogs and for the dogs, but also how those impact people's daily lives and how fixing those problems can also improve people's lives. And what we found across the board in any community, we interviewed 41 individuals in dog population management projects around the world. We found that in all of these cases where dogs aren't being looked after adequately by their owners, they cause all kinds of problems. These are the things like packing up. They may leave feces on the street, they may spread trash, they bark at night, they do all kinds of annoying things that affect our daily lives. But when that starts to happen, people stop being as tolerant of dogs. Even if I like dogs, I really might not feel great about them. And if we think about the way we think about rats and mice, for instance, that's how people begin to think of these animals. They're vermin, and they get in our way, and we don't want them around, which can lead to an acceptance of cruelty to those animals. Children throw rocks at them, we poison them indiscriminately, we may round them up and shoot them on a regular basis, and that becomes an accepted practice in communities, even where we have people who choose to have dogs or like dogs. And that, of course, engenders an environment where caring adequately for your dog is not something that we value, and so we continue to promote poor guardianship, which just deepens that cycle. So that's really bad news for dogs. Looking a little deeper, we found bad news for people too. When dogs start causing problems, as we talked about, people are annoyed, they're fearful, it stops them going about their daily business. And if you're a livestock owner, for instance, that could be a real threat, or someone whose business works on ecotourism of wildlife. If you have roaming dogs predating on your animals, you have a problem. So they cause real economic impacts as well. When you move to the stage where there's some intolerance for dogs in the community, people are beginning to throw rocks at them and treat them like vermin, you start to develop conflicts. And we met one woman in Bosnia who had a mama dog, had come and had a litter behind her apartment building. And she would sneak out in the middle of the night to feed these puppies because she felt terrible for those puppies and she knew they had nothing else. And she probably got some value out of spending time with that dog and her puppies. But she also knew that if her neighbors found out she was doing that, they would threaten her, they would yell at her, and they might go in retaliation and kill those dogs. So you can see the kind of personal conflicts people start to have. They start to see their enemies, their neighbors as their enemies. And at a broader community level, when you have this happening all over the place, you get people being more divided, not more connected. When you get people starting to accept cruelty to dogs, institutional cruelty or individual acts of cruelty, you get those conflicts, but you also have witnessing violence, children witnessing violence on a regular basis. And we know from research that that is correlated strongly with violence ultimately toward other individuals, lack of empathy development toward other individuals, animals, and people. And you begin to get people who care about animals distancing themselves from their governance in their communities because the government is doing something bad and I don't support them and they can't fix my problem and I no longer have faith in my institutions. And so what we see ultimately, if we want to take this back to the domains of happiness, clearly it's not only an animal welfare problem, it's a community problem that affects people's lives and well-being. It affects their living standards. It affects the psychological well-being of children and also adults. It affects our ability to have faith and good governance in the communities. It certainly can cause conflict and inhibit good social capital, which is critical in the development of vital communities, and can have environmental and economic impacts for the community. So clearly this is a community happiness and well-being issue, not just an issue for people who care about dogs. So for an example, to take the example from Bosnia a bit further, we were asked to come and help communities that were already engaged in some level of conflict around this issue. They'd identified that it was an issue, but it was intractable. They were unable to solve it, in part because people were very conflicted about what ought to be done. And we brought together a broad group of stakeholders. And what we found amongst those stakeholders was that they all thought they had the solution. My sterilization campaign is going to fix the problem. No, I don't trust you. You're stupid, and you side with the bad guys over there. The answer is actually to shoot all of the dogs. No, the problem is actually your fault. You promote doing that, and I have a different answer. And so people came in with their one solution, and it made it very difficult for them to speak to one another or hear one another about the real experiences they were having and what could be a solution to the problem. One thing we really emphasized was bringing a broad stakeholder group together. So it didn't matter if you were in the business because of coming to the meeting because you care about dogs or because you vehemently dislike the animals and you're really in that stage of thinking of them like vermin. If you have something to say on the issue, we wanted you in the room, not outside the room. And so we got a diverse group from hunters to teachers to the peace-building organization to the municipalities and neighborhood representatives from all walks of life. We walked those groups through a process of understanding what everybody's experiences were. So bringing them together, giving them space to hear and be heard, and then think about the root causes of their problems. So not the symptoms, not the blaming, but what really is ultimately causing our problems. And once we could build a shared perspective, we walked them through a planning process where the goal was for the community to come up with a program that they themselves could support and implement long term. So this was our attempt to not come in as an external group telling them what to do, but in fact to allow them to come to conclusion about what they could do for themselves. And in the end, all 6 communities we've worked in have been able to do this, and they've come up with strategies that are not earth-shattering. You can see the strategies they picked. They probably are the same ones that any international NGO might have tried. But the critical thing was that they were using their own energy and their own resources. One community thought, gosh, we don't have anyone to do this work that we think needs to be done, but we have firefighters sitting around, and they're not doing much a lot of the time. Let's train them to go handle dogs humanely and bring them into the vet clinic and take them back and, be the representatives of this project in the community. And municipalities would donate their community veterinarians' time and their veterinary stations to some of the activities they wanted to see. We saw teachers stepping up to incorporate lessons into their government, biology, and social studies lessons. So you saw them really digging deep to find the resources that they had because they had commitment to one another to implement these solutions and not because someone else had asked them to do it. And so we were really interested to find out how people felt that this process had changed what was going on in their community. And they were willing to tell us in anonymous surveys that they had changed their opinion about the problems with dogs vastly. And what that told us is that they were willing to take a step back from their own perspective and hear one another and come to a more common perspective. We also saw people indicating that they were strongly more engaged in their community than they had been previously. So where before there were some engaged people, probably ones who were blaming others, and a lot of people saying, not my problem. You saw a lot of people stepping forward, and this is in part because they were committed to one another as a community group, and because they saw that wherever they come from in the community, this issue was impacting them, and they could have a role in the solution as well. And then this last one really impacts me because it created optimism and confidence in the community. We asked them leaving, as they were about to launch their own plans, how confident they were that this was the right thing to do, that this was really going to create positive change in their community. And overwhelmingly, they told us they had confidence and optimism in what was happening in their community. If you think about a place like Bosnia, post-war, very conflicted, very high unemployment, and there's a lot of social issues happening in these communities. Think about the bright spark that it takes for someone to indicate that they have optimism and confidence. And the fact that we were able to bring them together and to get them to demonstrate confidence, not in us, but in each other, was a real spark for that community. What ultimately happened was a lot of action, and it was all being undertaken by members of the community. Just last week, one of the communities, Yaitza, was launching a community veterinary event, and I was watching from afar their Facebook page, and they had just decided to launch this out of nowhere. They launched a group of volunteers, they put together a Facebook page, and they were communicating every single day about what was happening. And they started off with messages about what you should do if you saw a tagged dog in your community. Know that it's safe, look out for it. But the truth was, a lot of those dogs weren't actually getting back out into the community, because once people started to see what was happening, they were coming and adopting dogs right out of the clinic. And one night they posted and said, "We're just about out of supplies. We need towels, we need dog food." And the next morning they said they could barely walk into their clinic because they'd been overwhelmed with donations overnight. And this was a little community where it was like pulling teeth to get people to come to a meeting at the beginning. So if you can just imagine the spark of excitement and energy that's happening there as a result of being brought together and starting positive change, it's really tremendous. But what we really, of course, are talking about here is how communities are happier. It's great that they're solving this one issue, but how are we affecting their lives? We're affecting people's ability to move safely to and from their houses, to and from market areas. They're instituting education programs in their schools that are based on values that they've articulated themselves about being humane and compassionate to one another and the animals in their midst. People are coming together to show leadership, and we've stopped hearing messages that people blame the government or blame others for what is or isn't happening in their community, and they're starting to step up and say, I can do that too. At the launch of our very first community, Lopare, the mayor made a point of grabbing a translator and coming over to us and saying, "Do you see those two gentlemen standing over there talking with one another? Before this project, they would never have been seen in the same place." And he followed up the next day. He said, "I just wanted to tell you again how important this was. This is the best development project we've had in our community since the end of the war." So at the beginning, I was saying that dogs affect community life in many, many ways, and that's true. But I think the converse is also true. We're talking about dog issues, which are pervasive and annoying, but probably not the top issue for some of these communities. We're talking about communities that are dealing with water access, food security, livelihoods, violence, unemployment. But I think that dog issues, because they impact our lives, but they're not that top critical issue, they're a really great way of getting people to be willing to come together. We might not have gotten people to come together and work together on an emotionally charged issue like gender violence or religious divide. But we were able to get them to come together around an issue like dogs and create that positive step forward in their community. And now we see those groups working with one another. We've built social capital. And I think, we've affected some critical issues just simply by addressing the dog issue. But we're also improving cultural diversity in the community by people's willingness to participate, the vitality of those communities, their trust in good governance that they can take forward with more democratic participation, and ultimately better time use and a better sense of working with one another and using their time in the ways they choose. So I'll leave that with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. I was keeping track, a lot of key words. Yeah, you got it. That was, I think, very inspirational. I very much appreciated hearing about this conflict, post-conflict situation, but how it was leading to interpersonal conflict and community conflict. And you said, what was bad news for dogs was bad news for people, and seeing how that was transferred, but really appreciated your walking us through the process that was used to bring the community together that led to this bright spark that was affecting their lives. So thank you. I think very compelling. So we're going to hear from Kimberly Wells next. And Kimberly is the Senior Animal Welfare Advisor at Brooke Action for Working Horses and Donkeys in London, in the United Kingdom. And I love the way that she describes her work. She says that she serves a cross-cutting role as a technical advisor, trainer, and facilitator. She works in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Middle East. And I don't know where she finds it, but she thinks she has some part-time, spare time to be studying media campaigning and social change. It sounds like you're pretty busy. But Kim, welcome. We're delighted to have you here. And we're looking forward to hearing a little bit more about your work.
Well, I wish I had all day, but I don't, so I'll get right to it. But yes, I have been living in the UK for the last 11 years, but I am from Massachusetts originally, so I'm afraid I don't come with a fun accent. But I do come with a really powerful message, and I hope I can take you through that. But I've been working at the Brooke for almost the last 10 years, and I was really inspired about the role that working equines play in communities around the world when I was studying a master's in animal behavior and welfare. And personally, I'm always someone who believes that we can make the best impact on animals by addressing the root causes of those issues. And ultimately, we need to make those changes through people. At the Brooke, we've been established as an organization for over 80 years. We were first developed by an inspirational woman named Dorothy Brooke, who was rescuing horses that had been abandoned after the First World War. So we began operating with hospitals to give these animals some respite and care. But over time, we really got to learn a lot more about the context in which these equines were working and the people behind them as well. So we have a multiple approach to try and improve the welfare of the animals. Again, making those changes are through people. So we work in community engagement at the level of the owner to help them understand basic husbandry and first aid and how to make the best use of available resources. But like all of us, caring for our own well-being has its limits, and at times we need to get help from those next level of talented individuals. And so we work within existing healthcare infrastructures as well to make sure that animals are being given a quality service and one that's available and affordable to them. So looking at that kind of supply and demand curve. And lastly, and I think what will form the basis of the case study that I'll share with you, is the advocacy work that we feel the need to do in the countries where we work. Because equines fall into a bit of a funny category. So they don't technically be defined as companion animals in the countries where we work, nor do they necessarily meet the traditional definition of livestock. So they're a bit of this kind of lost group of animals making a huge contribution to the livelihoods of people, but not necessarily included in the support networks and animal health schemes, even within veterinary education in these countries as well. So we're finding that work ever the more important in the countries where we are. So again, horses, donkeys, and mules play a really important role in the livelihoods of people. So there's 112 million of these animals in the world. Over 100 million of them are working in developing countries that are sometimes the sole means of a community of people. So anytime you're out there in the field and you look and you see maybe one horse, one donkey, one mule, there's often a family of 6 to 10 people who sit behind them, relying on that animal for an income. We were interested at the Brooke, particularly looking a bit more at the role that donkeys play in the lives of women, and this led us to want to collect some qualitative and some quantitative information that essentially helped us understand the roles that these animals play. Again, understanding that women are often the main carers of these animals, so what challenges do they have that on top of all the other responsibilities that they have? And finally, when we learn how much these communities depend on an animal to work side by side with them, they work side by side within domestic and commercial settings. Men, women, and children all play a role in some part in these animals' lives, looking to understand what would the impact be on a community if they didn't have that animal. And I think if we think a lot about things that we find really valuable within our own lives, I don't know how many people came to work through their own vehicle. We came by taxi because we were carrying a lot of heavy things. You start to think, what would happen if I didn't have those types of resources that I relied on a daily basis that I might take for granted? These are some of the quotes of some of the women that we spoke to. So at the Brooke, we pride ourselves in really trying to understand who are the people behind these relationships with the animals, and what do they have to say about how much these animals mean to them. A lot of people said that these animals are part of their identity. Some of these animals help women walk over 25 kilometers each and every day to get water that can be brought back to help feed their families, keep things clean, and feed the other livestock that they might have within their communities as well. And with these animals not in the picture, you can start to imagine what might that life be like for women, how much less water is coming back to the communities, how much heavier loads do the women have to carry, and who are the children who now have to be at home when the women need to be carrying those resources themselves. Finally, we can start to see that how much they value them because of how much household chores this helps. So these animals bring in some direct income from the types of jobs that they do, but they also create a lot of saving opportunities for the communities as well, because the animals can be used to fetch water, to fetch firewood, to bring manure to the agricultural lands that need to be plowed, and the animals can do that work as well. So they are this energy, traction, and drought power that are often really invisible. And so it has been a bit of the Brooke's mission to make sure that the role that they play to communities is getting more at the fore. So again, when we were conducting these focus group discussions with women in India, Pakistan, Kenya, and Ethiopia, we had 4 main conclusions. 77% of these groups were saying out of all the livestock they owned, the equines were the #1 important one that they would rank. We learned a lot about, again, the income, so the economic relationship that these animals have. So as I mentioned, some animals, it's their sole means of earning a living for their family. Again, how much these help women out with household chores, and something as well, how much of a social aspect these animals bring as well. So some of the money enables women to be part of different social groups, but also sometimes the women owning and using and caring for these animals can often help out other members of the community should they have an animal that becomes sick, or should they, rely on something else. Even in times during disaster and emergencies, these animals get to places where other mechanized vehicles can't often go. They can support drought efforts, things after emergencies, such as earthquakes as well. They've been getting the resources where they need to be, but also helping livestock and even humans get the health services that they require. So there's, as I said, thinking back to one of those first quotes, they're really part of these people's identity. This is not a very uncommon picture of what I see when I am working in the fields in the countries where we work. So you can start to imagine that if this is the animal that someone needs to use within the brick kiln industry, within coal mines, within timber markets, transporting grains to and from markets, upwards of 8-hour journeys each day both ways, you start to realize how a lot of issues can happen for the animals for a lot of different reasons. I've outlined some of them there. But this is starting to think about how productive can people be working these animals when they're in a condition like this. And so it starts to make the argument about how valuable it can be to ensure that communities, through the best of their available resources, the local infrastructure, and the governments, can provide support to what these animals require to stay a fit, functioning life for the people who depend on them the most. I've outlined a little bit, but again, thinking about what's affected out of this idea of the gross national happiness index when an animal isn't fit and able to thrive. We see issues where education is compromised. When an animal is out of commission, the rest of the community needs to come together, and children will often be pulled out of school to be involved in some of the industries to help the money keep coming in to support what people need. We start to see women having to make tough choices in terms of limited resources, what needs to come. So we start to see they make decisions to buy less nutritious food, which affects, the families that they're supporting. I've remembered meeting women in the field who said some days they have to choose, do I feed my child today? Do I feed my animal? And often they choose feeding the animal because of how important it is to their lives. Health certainly is getting compromised. If less water and less basic resources are getting back to a community, it's harder to keep things clean, the homes, the children themselves, and again, thinking about potential for disease spread is big. All these types of things, when life gets tough, we all know what stress feels like, and it's not always easy to feel like you can always be 100% in a good mental state. And physical, you can often see, and mental deficits to mental welfare are a lot harder, but it's happening for the animals as well as people. And again, when an animal isn't available, it's a lot more time that women and children and others have to do to make up for all the things that people need to keep a community functioning. And it affects that community vitality. When women are more busy, they have less time to participate in these social groups that support them in other parts of their lives that are important as well. So again, we're talking here about how much happiness matters. Income certainly is important, but again, thinking, how much important well-being is to people. There is an interdependent relationship between these animals and people, which is very much invisible, and it's invisible globally. And so we start to think, what are some of the main advocacy efforts for the Brooke? And it's to make sure that working equines are included within livestock policies, within the definitions, the censuses that occur, and as well as the databases. And it's looking at programs in human development. So again, where you see an equine, there's 6 to 10 people that rely on these animals sitting behind them. And it's all, it's understandable, I think, with all the other issues that we're trying to face, helping people out there in developing countries. It's hard to make animals number one, but they are part of the community. They live and work alongside, and there's a group of animals that can't be ignored when we're thinking about what makes up a community. And I think I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kim. I think it's very compelling to see this connection to a personal relationship that's tied to the identity and sort of having this sort of saving, support, social dimensions. And I think you end on a very, very compelling note. You say that those of us looking in think that it's very hard to make animals number one, yet when you talk to these women, they say the animals are already number one. So how do we bridge that gap? So very compelling. Thank you. So we're going to hear next from A. Alonso Aguirre. He's at George Mason University, where he's an associate professor and the Environmental Science and Policy Department chair. He works on a number of issues connected to a program on collaborative research that focuses on the ecology of wildlife disease and the links to human health and the conservation of biodiversity. He has authored a number of books and serves as the co-editor of EcoHealth, Journal of Wildlife Diseases, and European Journal of Wildlife Research. Alonso, welcome.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here. And actually, the sequence of speakers wasn't a thing on purpose, but it's built really nicely for my topics. I was asked to cover two huge topics. One was One Health, the other one sea turtle conservation. I grew up eating sea turtles in Baja, and I realized that's probably wrong. And I went to veterinary college. Back then, we used to run out to the streets because anatomy professor, in order to do dissections, we have to collect the street dogs. And they will be euthanized at the time of of the practice. So things have changed quite a bit in 40 years now. So I'll start with I found this slide. So for some reason, I didn't get the other nice slide that they presented. But I found that one, and interestingly, the domains are with 4 pillars. That was interesting to see: governance, environment, preservation, culture, and socioeconomic development. And interestingly, for the environment, you'll see only one point: ecological integrity and diversity, as compared to the other heavily anthropocentric, if you will, issues. And that's been a battle I had since I was a kid. Humans are first, and of course, I call this One Health field 20 years ago conservation medicine, that evolved into EcoHealth. And then now it's called One Health, until actually about 6 months ago, the Rockefeller Foundation and Harvard came out with planetary health. I think my next term is going to be interplanetary health, and so then we go from there. However, this photo was shared by a good friend of mine, Dr. Michael Koch. He's from Africa, actually Zimbabwe, and he said this is One Health, where animals, environment, and humans are totally integrated, something that we don't see in large cities like Washington, New York. They already mentioned here in the panel the infinite resources we have. Just to give you rough numbers, we already, to keep a family of 4 with a small car, small house, and just regular food consumption as an American or as a North American or Japanese, we need 4 to 6 planets. So we're already way above carrying capacity. Of course, 3/3 of the land is already used as, for food production, agricultural production, cattle production. And so we have a little percentage left to conserve the rest of species and ecosystems. That has led to a major turn of events in the last 30 years. Within my lifetime, I've seen devastation of elephants. Out of 10 million that we have, about 600,000 left for Africa. Being lost at several rates, you name it. There are many numbers, but put the numbers together within the next 7 to 10 years, at current rates, elephants will be extinct. How would you like to see your children just watching elephants at the zoo if they're still alive or in a photograph? And that's happening the same to rhinos. Roughly, on a WWF report, 60% of vertebrate populations have gone extinct since 1970. 60%. And so I have people in my talks who, I don't see it. We consume the same. We continue business as usual. My children now have cars, and their children have cars. So what's the deal? What is this all about? So we realize that health may be the paradigm to move forward, that health connects all the species in the planet. And health is a really fluid term. And One Health evolved from a term that we released back in the 80s, as I said, in conservation medicine, the practice of ecological health, meaning that the health of humans, ecosystems, and animals and plants too is all connected. And so that's the new paradigm being promoted everywhere in many agencies, government agencies. And why One Health? Well, first and foremost, we learned from the guinea pig in school. And I was just thinking, even today, we uncover toxins, diseases, and even agents that will hit first humans, then animals, domestic animals or plants or wildlife, and only to find later that we're going to hit somewhere else in the process. So these pathogens and toxins are jumping ecological barriers from one species to the next. And we're seeing this more often. We're trying to develop a systems thinking. We cannot be the regular MD, the regular veterinarian, just looking at health with the individual. We have to look from a molecular level across layers. This is from EPA, actually. Before they disappear, might as well show you this one. Showing individuals, populations, regions, and then continents, and hopefully global. And that's very hard to connect as we all as scientists work at different levels of this level. 2 major organizations, one, the One Health Commission, and here in DC, the One Health Academy, are groups that may be of interest for you. You want to follow up what's happening. And the One Health Initiative has all the information published on One Health, Conservation Medicine, EcoHealth, available for you. So it will be very easy for you to find the internet. And there's conferences. The last one was in Australia last year, bringing EcoHealth and One Health in the same meeting together. Interestingly, about 600 participants. A student wrote a small article in the internet saying that after all these years of promoting local populations, women, diversity, 70% of the speakers were white males over 50 years old. So things haven't changed so much. Everybody said, well, the meeting was in Australia. Nobody could afford it. Well, I think it's different than that. At the beginning, transdisciplinarity was mentioned. I defined that to my students, leave your ego at home and learn to listen. And that's, if you think about it, sounds very easy to tell a fisherman, stop fishing and stop killing the sea turtles. But yet we have other ways of consumption, other ways of using natural resources. And in this diagram that was shared by Dr. Val Beasley, a good friend, is that we continue in traditional disciplinary silos. Basically, on the one hand, experts don't help each other, and problems fall between the silos. Basically, like emerging diseases, toxics, species declines and extinctions, climate change, And then they are not treated as priority concerns. So each child will say, that's not my problem. It's somebody else's problem. This is what we need to do. And that has been very difficult to do. I've been working in this business for about 20 years. And even the word transdisciplinarity hasn't happened as we like to see it yet. This is what I like to see. A single circle calling it One Health, and really where we have huge bidirectional communication, also training students together, developing teams that will work in the field for many disciplines, and really comparing one another's databases. Even within the government, a database from USDA is not compatible with USGS, and they have 4 years of data. Different databases are not being merged. And now, of course, with the issue with climate change, many scientists are trying to move that information outside the country, or many have moved all that information of this country before it disappears. So we need to go beyond those disciplines. And of course, I gotta bring as chair of the ICOC of the university and being involved with many welfare issues with wildlife. I actually was one of the beginners working with protocols to develop for the humane care of wildlife projects. Those guidelines were developed for lab animals. I was talking to Kim earlier. And then all of a sudden, spillover wildlife in the late 90s, nobody wanted to deal with it. It's only wildlife, we just gonna trap them, release them, and sometimes euthanize them, so what? So really, One Health, as Dr. Fox mentioned it, has to be implemented using our bioethics on an equal consideration, must be applied to all species. Otherwise, things won't work. Sustainable use of species. Again, this is a classical example from South America, the use of vicuña wool, or hair, if you will. These vicuñas are wild, and they're trapped, and so stress has been measured, pretty stressful for the animals. Then they're shared, and then they're released back again into the wild, looking at temperatures and all that. So we do have to look at sustainable use, but then also animal welfare at the same time, and eventually looking at these species in a productive way, but also how can we bring good care of the species long term. My expertise has been the interface of land and sea. 71% of the planet is water. Only less than 1% is protected, as compared to about 5 to 7% of land mass protected. So a lot of things are happening. So switching to the concept of One Health, I'm gonna go to my homeland, Baja California. Many things part of the US, so probably the world won't go there, so that's good. But it's a very productive ecosystem, highly endemic. 90% of the species of marine mammals come there to feed. You will never see anywhere in the Pacific about 40 blue whales feeding in the same spot. So you can see the biomass that exists in this ecosystem. And also it's relatively pristine. Well, not anymore. What's happening to the oceans within my lifetime, I remember the geography professor in high school will say, the future of humanity is the oceans. Well, I can tell you, not anymore. We have collapsed every single fisheries in the planet. And what my grandmother used to feed the pigs, now is prime fish in American tables. A very large predatory fish is gone. Basically, we have taken too much, we have put too much in, and we destroy all our coastal wilderness. There are some positive things that have happened. One of the few sustainable fisheries in the planet is right in Baja, because the same fishermen, like in Maine, are their own police, and they run through cooperatives. So 6 months is abalone, 6 months is lobster, and every fisherman needs to bring that their catch and get paid right on the spot after doing this. So it's very sustainable and very good. All the food goes to Japan, Europe, but that's okay. I guess that's part of business. Development is happening fairly quickly. The government has sold every single piece of land that could be sold to foreign investors. So it's the hottest real estate in the planet, in the millions. And massive development is happening. You will see a lot of boats and also aquaculture and shrimp. If you want to do something for the planet, don't eat shrimp unless you know where it comes from. There's a lot of, we can talk over the break about the implications. We have some alternatives for this, and we have to involve the community. We have to use the many disciplines to work with them, manage fisheries. We have to reduce the illegal consumption, and then also try to come up with green labels. One issue that I worked for several years with my colleagues, Hoyt Peckham, Jay Wallace Nichols, who started his PhD right there, and he turned into advocacy because of this issue, is the stranding of loggerheads. And loggerheads have stranded in the thousands. We, in fact, every season come up and set up these cemeteries along the way, looking at mortality is all linked to fisheries. So bycatch is the primary cause of mortality of sea turtles, marine mammals, and seabirds, if somebody asks you. I've been working with this disease for also over 25 years, fibropapilloma disease. I'm just waiting for the first human to show up with this lesion so we can get the funding to figure out what's the cause. We have found 3 different viruses. We have found contaminants, but yet we don't know the cause. It's prevalent in many populations of sea turtles, but this led me to work with local communities. And going back to Baja, being born there, gives you a different perspective in working with the local community because they see you as a local, not somebody just coming from the outside to tell them what to do. So that was helpful for me in a way. And sea turtles are extremely valuable for the locals in any way you can think of. Sea turtles, usually they're associated with family, tradition, virility, spirituality, and health. And so that tells you basically the principles of happiness in a way. 2 ways of mortality, I told you about bycatch, but then we have bykill. And purposely kill these turtles, about 35,000 of them each March, April, during Lent for human consumption. And most of the consumers are teachers, government officials, and of course some community leaders. We're trying to change that for many years, and that continues. Jay Nichols came to Baja to work on this, and he found these cemeteries where hundreds of turtle carcasses were dumped, and found out the high consumption of sea turtles at all ages, from 3 years old all the way to 50 years old. And so poaching will have an impact long term. We're still trying to figure out, but the life of these turtles is so long that it's hard to determine at this point. So Nichols and others started the Sea Network of the Californians, a research group with the local communities. They started in 6 points, showed here in the Gulf of California, 2 sites, Bahia de Los Angeles and Loreto, and the Pacific Coast 4 sites. And through those communities, where they already are at the 19th year, the meetings is every January, where communities get together. They trap turtles twice a month for 6 months. They measure them. They identify 2 species, they get blood samples for health, and they'll come and report to the whole community. So the same fishermen now that used to be poachers and consumers, now they're turning to conservation, really protecting sea turtles in many ways. These are all the communities now involved throughout the peninsula. And has been a very successful project, but still we have the issue of consumption. And so I've been thinking, why still people throw garbage on the streets? Why people don't understand we should plant trees? But I was as a kid thinking that way. Well, in Mexico, putting the garbage in another place didn't work because there were no garbage containers. So you gotta bring one thing and the other together. Then I realized, talking to a fisherman in Holbox Island in the Yucatan, he said, since we were kids, we had the importance of eating turtles impressed upon us. It is as they taught you as a child to believe in the Virgin Mary. And then from one day to the next, they tell you not to believe in her. I said, oh, he's totally right. How can we change those cultural bases to that? So we started a huge campaign. Nichols and several NGOs downloaded back then a photo from the White House. This photo came out and released this card saying, eating sea turtle makes you slow. So that didn't work. Well, we go beyond. I took a photo in an aquarium in Costa Rica where this sea turtle showing Viagra. My eggs are not a solution. As you may know, sea turtle eggs consumption are related to virility in many Latin American countries. But I can tell you that doesn't work. In fact, one chicken egg equals exactly in content on protein and minerals and nutrients as 2 sea turtle eggs and nothing else. So they don't work. So probably Viagra, well, that didn't work. So a famous Argentinian model volunteered to be photographed to be part of this government campaign in Mexico, saying my man doesn't need sea turtle eggs. And so sea turtles are in danger of extinction. Well, that fired back. That didn't work. So what about maybe health? Health as a powerful motivator. Will that do it? I put this as an example, as some of you may remember, with West Nile virus was introduced in New York in 1999. CDC chasing mosquitoes, spraying mosquitoes, the virus killing a few people, lots of horses, lots of wildlife. And yet it reached within 3 years the West Coast. CDC declares an endemic, funding is gone. And that's what we do. WWF, WHO, FAO, CDC, we all react to epidemics or to situations like this. What we try to do with the Network California is not only developed all this biological information, ecological information on mortality, health, movement, recovery, but also we have to do credibility, trust, understanding, transparency. Responsible fisheries have been part of the workshops. A lot of materials from comics to flyers to local radio. Billboards in the US-Mexico border. You may have seen, would you eat a panda? Do not eat sea turtles. Would you eat a whale? Do not eat sea turtles. There's a festival where a queen will be elected every season. Just to finish up, Ceres, a local community within Baja, and you see the island on your right side, close to the mainland, that's Tiburon Island. And those Ceres were just basically use the resources there as they want. And they've been using sea turtles for long term. In fact, they still allowed to do that. The last sea turtle, in fact, a leatherback, seen back then was in 1991. So it was used for ceremonial purposes. And it was in the meeting in 2005 that they decided to revive that ceremony. And that was done with a bone found with sea turtles, and they brought some hatchlings, they were released. And this is a poem that was, they will sing about sea turtles, of course eating and singing and drinking. It's going to take a long time to develop these effective partnerships in breaking those silos. It is your option. You want to go the eco or the ego way. There's both doctrines of schools there. We have to think globally, acting locally, but also thinking locally, acting globally. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alonso. I think a number of compelling images and messages from that very first image of One Health to what we see with the sea turtles and the degree to which health has served as a powerful motivator, but also making the case again for transdisciplinary research and why that's important. So thank you very much. Let's open it up. We'd like to see what questions you have. So if you have any thoughts, questions, please raise your hand. My colleagues will come to you and give your name, your affiliation. And if you get quickly to your question or comment, so we can take a few at the same time. So any questions, thoughts, or comments? Yes, please, at the back.
Hi, my name is Puyu Ling from the University of Maryland. I have a question about in terms of valuing the animal and then work with the local community. I'm thinking of the case in Indonesia, for example, that the orangutan habitat is losing because of the palm oil plantation. And yet the people there are like poor, so that they don't really have the incentive to, conserve the orangutan habitat. So I wonder, like in such cases of conflict of the immediate needs of the people versus the longer term needs of conserving the habitat of the orangutan or other wildlife species in Indonesia. So how in this case would you guys solve such problems? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yes, any other questions? So I have a few questions to you. So Beth, I was quite taken when you started us off, and you mentioned that we have a tendency to value pieces of the animal. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how we get to the point of valuing the animal in its entirety, and the experience of having the animal, working with the animal, and the animal being part of the community overall. So if you could talk a little bit about that. And I wonder if I could ask each of you to talk a little bit about what has been particularly difficult for you in your work. So we've heard a lot of success stories. We've been inspired. And I know that when we have these conversations, folks say to me, you know what, we want to kind of hear what failed. We want to hear a little bit of a fail fest. Where have you not succeeded? Where did you make your mistakes? And what did you learn from that? So how can we learn from where you've made some mistakes? So I wonder if I could ask all of you just to briefly give one example to talk a little bit about that. So why don't we start with a question for a situation like Indonesia, immediate needs versus longer term needs, the holistic experience of the animal and its contributions and failures. So can we start with you?
Yeah, if I could answer the Indonesia question, I happened to be on a panel at the Earth Optimist Summit a couple weeks ago with a really inspiring person from a group called Health and Harmony. I'm not sure if you've heard of them, but they work in Indonesia. And the founder of that group talked specifically about some work she's doing in Indonesia and talked about it. Basically, she had been doing some work in college and then came back and got she became a doctor and went back. And she talked to the community for 6 months. She did interviews with everyone in the community, and her premise was this forest, and these orangutans particularly, are of value to everyone in the world. And she knew the illegal loggers who were cutting down the trees because it was a matter of saving the lives of their children, getting health care for their children. I mean, they knew that the trees were valuable for their own health and, for the rest of the world and, carbon and everything else. But they were making immediate decisions that were basically save my family or not save my family. These are critical decisions, and they wanted to keep the trees, but they needed to save the lives of their children. And she said, as a thank you from the rest of the world for saving these trees, what do you need? And they said, we need basically two things. All we know is slash and burn agriculture. We don't know how to do it any other way. That's the way they've done it for generations. It's not sustainable anymore, but no one's told us any other way to do it. She said, okay, we'll fix that. We'll figure it out. And we need affordable, good health care so that we don't have to make that decision every time we need to, pay for a C-section or something like that, or save our children from disease. So she went to another part of Indonesia to find out how to do organic agriculture. She brought some people back. They learned how to do it. They're doing that now. They don't have to do any more slash and burn agriculture. And she is a doctor, and she brings doctors over to, teach Indonesian doctors there. They have what they need for health care. They haven't had any illegal logging in the communities where she works since. And they've saved the forest for 2,000 orangutans in that case. I mean, I'm sure that's not the exact model for every place that you work, but it is a model in Indonesia. And we all need that forest to be saved. They don't want to cut down those trees. It worked for that particular case. So I think that was incredible. And the organization is called Health and Harmony. It's, for anyone who's interested, it's absolutely incredible. They operate on a shoestring. It's great.
If I could just add to that, I'm glad that you mentioned them. We've had them here a few times. They're one of our collaborators. If you go to our blog platform, newsecuritybeat.org, and put in Health and Harmony, we've written up their work. So there's some case studies, there's some presentations, and we have some audio of their presenting their work here. So,
and as for the I think valuing the lives of the animals versus the parts of the animals it truly takes a change in measurement first. I mean, you have to know what, you have to have a broader sense of value in order to value the lives of animals. And so, in the case of the Genuine Progress Index is, what I mentioned that they measure, I'm a Marylander, we measure that in Maryland. And so for an example, you would have the gross state product, which is GDP for Maryland. And then you add things like, so if you convert an acre of wetland in Maryland, whatever you're converting it to presumably is more productive from an economic sense. So that would count in your GDP, GSP, your gross state product. But what you're losing in ecosystem services or whatever doesn't count in any way in GDP, GSP. So you have to subtract that ecosystem service measure. Now that's not going to actually value an animal. It's still a dollar value, but it goes a lot further when you count all 26, 28 measures now, or whatever. There's a new version 2.0 of that measure in Maryland. But you're going to get a lot closer to an accurate value of genuine progress in the state than you do with your gross state product. And so I think, given where we are in the United States, moving from GDP to gross national happiness is probably not our next step. But it would get you it would get you closer to measuring something broader. And I think that's the only way that we're going to be able to make decisions that more accurately reflect the value of what matters to us, like a whole animal's life, than the pieces of an animal that you can sell. And I mean, I don't think there's a good example out there of a system that's in place that really can measure intrinsic value and that can really measure those things. If we did, we wouldn't be facing the sixth extinction crisis, and we wouldn't be facing development of protected areas everywhere you turn. And we just came from New York. We had a panel in New York, and I'm surprised that Central Park is still there. Because when you look at Central Park and you look at the development pressures that must be constantly on Central Park, but there's something that people value in having that there, that they value more than having another office building, that people are willing to say, no, I'm not going to do that. I value this green space and whatever animals are there because it brings me happiness. It brings me more happiness than whatever money can be exchanged to put another office building there. If we could quantify that and extend it, we would have that in all of our daily lives.
Great. Thank you. Lonzo?
You asked for failures.
And you spoke about a few. You talked about some of the messaging around sea turtles that
This
didn't work.
sea turtle program has been going on. I mean, Mexico stopped, several countries stopped apparently the illegal trade of sea turtles in 1981. So we haven't been very successful in turning things around. We continue dealing with the same problems. So one of the issues that I learned many years ago, I became a veterinarian because I hated humans. So I said, I don't have to see a human ever again. I'm going to work with my animals. Wrong. 90% of the time, you're going to work with people before you even get to the animals. Even as a wildlife veterinarian, international field wildlife veterinarian from an NGO, I got to go to the field maybe 2 months and actually work with animals. The rest is dealing with other many issues. And so the failure is being not able to bring the social sciences into all our scientific programs, and really strengthened sociology, anthropology, basic psychology that we never treasure as natural scientists, because we think it's kind of a soft science, not very objective. But it's so important now to bridge that gap and bring all those disciplines together to work in a way. George Mason has a program called Pushing as many universities STEM, but they came out with STEAM, adding the arts to STEM. And that's the other side of the brain. I'm a guitar player. I like to paint. I like to dance. As I do with other part of my brain on the science. So they're really close together, and that's what people need to develop. Then you realize you got to bring all those together to be able to flourish, not only as a person, as a family or community, but as a human race.
So, Alonso, one of the things that occurs to me is, we interact with a lot of young people. And I assume that you do also at the university. And this question of crossing disciplines is one that we hear very often. I sit on an advisory board of the NSF, and that's our role, to help the NSF bring social science into natural science. But I wonder, what advice would you give to a young person who has listened to our discussion today, who's read the report and said, this makes sense to me. I want to build a career in this space, and I'm now starting out. What advice do you give to a young person to have the kind of impact that we are talking about? How does one get started in this field? What advice would you give for someone who's young and starting out?
Oh, that's for me too?
Yeah, that's for you.
All right. The advice already said, learn to listen, leave your ego at home. But not only that, I think the most important one is to get them to talk to a totally different community and go out in the field. I mean, I'm still shocked until recently to talk to high school kids in the Bronx, and they still believe that milk and eggs come from the supermarket, and they don't understand the basic process of how actually we raise our chickens, and that will give you eggs, right? And so the advice is really to get involved in community projects, get involved at all levels, talk to your, get out of the regular comfort zone, get out of the box. And now Mason has these new classrooms, interactive classrooms, and I got lucky to get one last semester. And you can see the productivity of students going way up, because they gotta be in circles, interacting to one another, and I give take-home exams if they want to meet whenever they want to, open book, but they gotta act as a transdisciplinary team.
Yeah.
And theme breaking that silo is probably the most important advice.
Great. Thank you. Kim, your thoughts?
Yes. I guess going back to the Indonesia example, I mean, in the countries where we work, we do face individuals that are unknowingly causing harm to animals in some instances. And it's like anything else. If you need to see a change in human behavior, just simply someone coming to you and saying, don't do that, isn't enough. We know that through smoking and various other campaigns, that's one of the issues. So I think at the Brooke, we're a strong advocate of alternative livelihoods when we need to see a complete change in something. And an example I can give is a local service provider or a traditional healer that was in Pakistan. He was basically having a whole business of slitting the nostrils of equine animals, and that was a request that was often made from community members because that was what they understood to be helpful, to help the animals breathe when they're struggling in some temperatures, working 10, 12 hours a day in 50-degree conditions in dusty, quite horrific environments, that would be something that would help the animals. You know, if we again look at the science, we're an evidence-based organization, those actions are not contributing to any well-being for those animals, but yet we have an individual who prides himself that that's his job that's valued. So again, I think sometimes it's making sure we really take the time to understand the community and what is it about them that gives them pride in their day, and where can there be an alternative in that. When we showed what this individual could do as a different form of business in terms of basic first aid to these animals and helping that individual realize that the nostril slitting practice wasn't helpful, all of a sudden he became an advocate not only against that practice, but what should be done instead. And to me, that just, you know, if we think about generations of animals to come and people to come, that individual has become a change agent. And I think, so again, that point on alternative livelihoods. I can touch quickly, I think one of the failed things that the Brooke has learned with 80 years of experience is that a blanket approach doesn't work. I think we get, you know, we work in a very broad range of cultures and communities, races, sexes, ages, et cetera. And I think when we hit a win in one area, we automatically have sometimes thought, well, we can do the exact same thing over here and have the same success. And so I think what we learned by that not happening is a little bit of faith in the process. I think thinking a bit to some of Kate's presentation, taking that time to show the community how to discuss issues and ways that they can solve problems no matter what the problem is, was a good lesson learned for us.
Great, thank you. Kate?
Yeah, sure. So speaking to the question of failure, gosh, in dog population management, you have so many. I think historically, groups working on issues where there were dog welfare concerns in communities have come in and had an idea about what to do, and have tried to institute capacity with building, or what they would call like best practice. And that springs to mind as one of the things that very often fails. And it fails because it comes in assuming a set of values that even with best of intentions, bringing a set of values that just don't match the values of the community, or working in a way that doesn't work for the community. And that is the kind of failure that we continue to try to learn from. Even as we got better at that and we started saying, look, we need to sit with communities and we need to bring a broad set of stakeholders together. Even this process that was so successful in Bosnia, we tried it once in a community in southern Chile, and it did not work. And I think there are two reasons that it didn't work. The first is it was a very early attempt to bring the community together, and they were very excited about the process. But we expected that as a result of that excitement, they would move forward on their own. And we actually had to realize that there's a combination of push and pull. We couldn't just excite them and then step back and let them come up with their own solutions, but that we needed to hold their hands and mentor just a little bit until the community started to see the impact of their actions. And that was when, in those Bosnian communities, the spark really lit under them and they took off on their own. And the other was a failure of leadership in that community. And we've come to really recognize the importance of working with good leaders in the community. It doesn't have to be the leader of the community, but there has to be a good leader who is from and among that community, who has the power to convince others to do things or to allocate resources. And when you don't have that, you do have another set of very big challenges to face.
So the follow-up question I'd had for you on the success in the Bosnia case that you talk about is, how do you sustain these efforts? So you talk about having a good leader, you talk about this process of community engagement, so that community interests will keep the momentum going for a little bit. But how do you really sustain these efforts over a long period of time?
I think it's not our job to sustain them. Ultimately, the community is supposed to sustain these efforts, and that's what we're seeing, is that communities are starting to form networks of people who are changing the way that they fundamentally think about this. I hope that in 5 years they don't have to have a big dog management plan, that it's just something they do. It's just something they don't have to think too hard about, and that the culture and behaviors of dog owners and the community managers has changed. We're too early in the process to say whether that's happened, but it was designed specifically so that we're not in charge of sustaining that effort. Once it gets going, the community has allocated the resources and made the decisions that is simply what's going to happen in their community.
Great, thank you. Sean?
So I wanted to just talk about the question about Indonesia because we're talking about another great ape, and our work is on chimpanzees, another great ape, and connect it with the question on one of our lessons learned. I think that when we're talking about cases like the one you brought up with Indonesia, it's very easy for us to come with assumptions that are overgeneralized and oversimplified. We don't really know until we've communicated with communities and we've really listened to communities what their motivations are for how their land is being used or misused. And I think that those kinds of overgeneralizations and oversimplifications really drive a lot of conservation action in the wrong direction. I think that there is another problem that's related to that, that's access to information on how land is being used. There's a really amazing tool that I would encourage everyone to go check out. It's called Global Forest Watch. It's a huge project supported by the World Resource Institute, and we're really glad to be one of the partners in helping implement Global Forest Watch. They have a great emphasis on how land is being used in Indonesia, and what that project has done is actually democratize the access to information on how those forests are being used so that communities, as well as the corporations that are using the land, as well as the policymakers that are giving the permits for using the land, is available to everyone. And they can work together as they're listening to each other on how they plan to use their land together. So I think that's a really important factor in addressing those kinds of issues. And I think related to our own work and learning that, when Jane discovered that the habitat had been destroyed for those chimpanzees, we think about destruction of habitat, and our immediate solution is let's go plant a bunch of trees. And certainly that's a great solution in some environments, but again, it's an assumption. And it's an assumption that may or may not be well informed. And adding in this process of planning and using data like data that's available from Global Forest Watch and other partners, we're really fortunate to work with Esri and Google and Digital Globe on getting access to high resolution satellite imagery. Getting that kind of information to help inform our work has been really important. And initially going into it, we had that original assumption that let's just go plant trees and that's going to help. But that success story that I showed you was not a result of planting trees. It was a result of planning. It was a result of going in and working with those communities to get them to set aside those village forest preserves and ultimately allowing 10 years to pass. All of that green came back just because that land was left alone, not because necessarily people were planting trees. So I think that was a really important aspect and learning for us.
Great, thank you. So I have, you have a burning question. Go ahead. Yes, the microphone's coming.
Not brilliant, but I wanted to say thanks for such an interesting and compelling set of presentations. What I wanted to reflect back to you, it's not really a question, it's a reaction, which is that, picking up on Kimberly's point about the global invisibility and Roger Marx, how do we transform global invisibility into something that is actionable? Interdisciplinarity seems a vital first step, but in my estimation is not going far enough, because it does not address the fundamental value system which is built in to our sciences and discipline. And at the top of that is, and thanks so much, Alonso, is anthropocentrism and an economic growth premise and a deference to growth economics by other disciplines, which so that somebody can say, you can say, my ecosystem that I care about is being damaged. My animals are being damaged, and somebody plays literally nowadays the trump card, jobs. End of discussion. Unless we can grapple with the value foundations which are inherent in our Western disciplines and in local cultures, it's something which is shared very much across those, we don't get anywhere. We get adoption of increasingly westernized consumption system. and erosion of the local cultures, and we fail to recognize anthropocentrism in those local cultures where it exists. So what I would like to do really, Alonzo, is applaud your suggestion to get social science more deeply integrated into those as a, if you will, a self-reflective, critical wedge against the hegemony of the worldviews which now govern our economics and our governance and our political systems. Because unless we can put the brakes on and find a steady state solution for these things, we go nowhere from here. So I think you all know that, and it's not a question, but that reaction has been really elicited by your terrific talks and the
Great.
work you're doing.
Thank you for that. That was great. That's a nice way to round us off as we go into our reception. But I think we've had a really good discussion today around the report and sort of the various dimensions of the Gross National Happiness Index, which we talked about. And that led us to think a little bit about how do we measure well-being? What are the implications for measurement? And once again, looking that the GDP is not the way to do this. And how do we measure what money can't buy? How do we get to that point? What's the role of a more holistic approach that brings us and animals and the planet closer together? And what is the research that's behind that? What is the evidence base that we can use to inform our programming, our decisions, our actions? I think we were able to see that across a series of geographies in California, in Maryland, in Tanzania, in Bosnia, in India. So a number of really good case studies to bring that home for us. How do we address this question of the invisibility of these connections? We looked at that through a process that brought various stakeholders together, which entailed an example of finding new things for not too busy Bosnian firemen to do, from looking at women as caretakers of donkeys, to researchers, to bringing together hunters, teachers, police hoarders, nurses, those who are disabled, and a charismatic leader like Jane, who could help mobilize others and young people. So understanding that process that helps bring this invisibility to light and what it means for working across disciplines, and how does that tie to our value system and our role and the intrinsic values that we bring to the way that we view the world. And I think that led us to some different perspectives. We talk about the human-animal conflict. We talked about the transformative role of animals in post-conflict situations, which was very informative. So that was a good way for us to think about transformations in this context. We also talked a little bit about how hard it is to make animals number one, but yet when we engage these communities directly, it's already there. Hello, it's there. The animals are number one for these communities. So there's a disconnect there. There's the invisibility, but there's a disconnect. How do we bridge that? How do we become more aware, conscious, deliberate, purposeful, impactful in navigating that difference? We also had, I think, some really good examples of failures. What has not worked in terms of interventions, in terms of assumptions, perceptions, but also messaging, and how do we mobilize for our advocacy and communications, and thinking of the One Health framing as an important dimension that we could be thinking of embracing, massaging, and see what that means moving forward. So health is an important motivator for action. Wow, that was great. That was amazing. So now we get to continue this discussion over reception. So as you step out the room, we have some goodies and some drinks for us to continue to engage and have this conversation. And I'll encourage you to also have a look. We have a current exhibit from a very well-established environmental photographer, Gary Brush, who passed away last year in a diving accident on the Great Barrier Reef. But at the moment, on 3 levels, we are highlighting Gary's work on documenting climate change impacts on animals, on humans, on communities. So you will see these photo exhibits on 3 levels here. Please have a look at that. I think you'll find them very compelling and moving. So please join me in thanking our panelists for an engaging discussion.